Abigail Thorn, aka Philosophy Tube, opened up the hood on reality.
Yes.
To
looking at the engine.
Yeah, looking at the way we do categories socially, and what our social constructs have to do with any sense of underlying reality or structure that is there, biological, physical, conceptual, whatever it may be. And she was working out these abstract thought problems, and then at the end reminded everyone that you know what I'm really talking about.
Yeah, these have political consequences.
Right, for race, gender, sex.
There's a metaphysical, dimension to these things that we could make explicit for ourselves.
And I think we both were saying we appreciated how Abigail began what would otherwise be a very contentious, heated, emotional type of exchange in a more dispassionate, philosophical way, looking at how we understand the nature of a thing and its properties. And so I applaud any effort to approach the issue of, say, trans rights in a more philosophical way first, so that we don't rush in with overconfident political opinions, about who should and should not be allowed to do what, when,
Yeah.
But there wasn't much in the video about the specific issues around trans rights and trans freedom, and I don't know if we want to go into the specific issues, but I think just on a philosophical level, there's some pretty fascinating questions to ask about biological sex.
Yeah, or even just biological categories in general, because that was something she was contesting too.
Right.
She was doing what would you call it? What do they call that? Where you imagine alternative scenarios. So she was imagining Earth 2. And I think we were Earth 1, right? Or we Earth 0?
I think we're Earth 0.
Okay.
Maybe we're 1. I don't know.
And then there's -1, and they all sort of have different constructions. Or, if we're thinking with Barfield, they all have different collective representations. And, whatever the subtext of the collective representations.
Each planet constructs social reality according to its own arbitrary categories.
Yeah, they are presented as, arbitrary.
And so when it comes to something like racism or transphobia, the idea is that there are certain ingrained social habits that are arbitrarily constructed that are unjust and need to be reformed and replaced with some other vision of categories. Or is it just a different relationship to categories as such? I think that's an interesting question to ask, because of what pisses off the feminists. They're called TERFs by, trans exclusionary radical feminists, by trans people, but...
Well, not just trans people.
And by allies of trans people, but these biologically female feminist activists are worried that allowing trans women to say trans women are women crosses a line somehow. And so the trans women want to they really care about the category woman. They think it's a real category and they want to belong to it. And radical feminists also think it's a real category and that they want it for themselves. And so rather than a new way of thinking about categories, what I'm saying is even the trans movement is kind of reifying the categorization.
I would just be careful. I just want to say that I think that's a bit generalized, because I don't think every trans individual would think the same way, about the issues.
Definitely. I agree.
Or radical feminists,
Yeah. That's a big problem, that we just speak in these generalizations. Again, So I guess maybe what would be interesting to talk about is to what extent we can relate to these categories or social constructs or natural essences if we want to be more, essentialist about it.
There's something. Okay. I think there's also something kind of mythological at play as well, because that's there's something I would say that's connected with the psychological, the psyche, and there's like certain images that we feel almost like we feel inspired to almost like worship through the presentation of our person. That's a transpersonal. I think that's the transpersonal dimension.
So
of sex and gender and all that.
Right. So there's a way in which essences, universals, categories, archetypes, they can be of great support to our human efforts to liberate ourselves and bring about a more just society. I mean, obviously justice itself would be an example, but the idea of justice,
formerly a being,
as a motivating factor,
a divinity,
a goddess. But these categories, these universals, they can also really pit us against each other, divide us within ourselves even, when we think of them too abstractly, I guess.
Too literally.
And so this is what I'm trying to surface, is that politically, I think, to engage in a more fruitful kind of conversation across the divide between whatever the issue, Republicans and Democrats in America on the issue of race or on the issue of trans rights, would be to begin with asking if we can take a new relationship to these categories rather than fighting over the categories.
Oh, you know what I just realized? This is very interesting because I think, around issues of gender and sex and race and all that, these are kind of like almost like at the heart of the culture right now. And, and this inheritance of kind of Western ideas. And, and it's forcing, this is what I think was really significant about Abigail's video, is there's this forcing of ontological politics into the conversation, because now the relationship to categories is being questioned, and it already has been, right, by different cultures, by, indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans, who were assimilated into the culture. But just that resistance, ongoing resistance between, for example, like in Standing Rock and the protection of the lands, that's a sort of ontological politics thing. But it's not even, it's been kind of pushed aside as like, not scientific, right? It's,
right.
But gender and sexuality, it just like, it grabs people, everyone sort of. And so it's really forcing these questions, ontological, political sort of things.
Right.
That could, then expand back out to more fundamental things like Abigail questioned, even the measuring of anything, actually. The measuring of anything as ultimately socially constructed.
Right. And therein lies our human freedom to construct society otherwise.
Construct everything otherwise.
Right. But so this is my problem with the social constructionist, like, radicalism would be, my problem with it is that it might not be giving enough, paying enough respect to the archetypal powers that assert their own purposes prior to the human will.
Yes,
and
that we're shaped from.
We have to come into relationship with wills other than our own and intelligences other than our own that are far more ancient and far more powerful ultimately. Even though we have this freedom, we're also in relationship to others.
Yes.
And so not everything is a human social construct.
Yeah.
I worry about that kind of anthropocentrism.
Yeah. Well,
a diminished sense of the human, at least.
It's interesting just to note that this is transpiring at the same time as the ecological crisis and all these intense experiences around the world that people are having of climate change, like we are having in California with the heat and the fires and these lightning strikes in India that I just heard about, and whatever it is,
fires. I mean, but we're not in California, but we're not used to thinking of these ecological agencies as just that, agencies.
Yeah, exactly. That nature, and I
nature
think
has agency.
Related to the fact that human beings have discerned categories, and now we kind of have like a dead husk of like maybe the more living relationship to kinds and forms, but that nature itself has been the one that has taught us that. And I'm speaking in a way that sort of makes it sound like we are bifurcated, but in a sense our culture is. And that's the way, there's like different ways of poetically talking about this. Yeah.
No, we have isolated the notion of a kind from the notion of kinship.
And life.
And the thing is that, yes, there is a differentiation into kinds, but a kind always presupposes a broader relationship of kinship to all the other kinds. Right? There's no kind that is truly independent of any others. It is always defined by its relationship.
Is that how it meant? Is that the connotation etymologically, or is that just something you're saying? Because I agree with you, but I'm just wondering.
Yeah, if you think of the Greek, like gene, in Genesis.
Okay.
I believe that's where kind comes from.
I don't know where it comes from. But anyway, the point you're making, I agree with.
Yeah, I mean,
kind.
I don't want to be.
It's like the
foisting a false etymology on everyone, but I think the notion of, I think it's more than just a poetic coincidence that kin and kind, I think there's a relationship there. And the point is to say that any particular difference always is differentiated from a background of sameness.
Like in the Timaeus.
Right, and so again, it's about a different way of relating to these categories. I mean, category itself in the Greek, agora, right? It's like the city center, the place where everyone gathers. I want to say the marketplace, but that has capitalist implications that I don't mean to imply. It's the place where everyone comes together to haggle each other about how to define the political domain. Like, how much will you give me for this? Or you going to allow me to do that? Or like, what if I trade this for that? Or, the place where contracts are established. And that's like laws are made, and they're made in the Senate too, but we work it out in it's the public discourse,
Yeah.
That's where categories are made, obviously. So yes, they are social constructs, but what about all the mythic, cosmic, and spiritual powers that are influencing the human community in the making of those categories? Like, we're not just alone here on the earth. I mean, we exist beneath the stars, the sun and the moon, amongst all of these other forms of life on planet Earth, and all of them have agency.
And we're, connected to the primordial past of the cosmos.
Right, through our own bodies.
In the future.
Our own bodies. There are agencies in our own bodies that our will has no power over. Or do you think that's not true?
I don't know either way.
Well, I mean, if you believe in the possibility of the resurrection of a physical body, that implies the human will, at least in the form of Christ, can literally get all the other agencies of the body into line to bring the body back.
Yeah.
But scientifically speaking, there's all this physiological activity throughout my body that I have no conscious control over. I can't reconstruct it just by imagining it or willing it.
Yeah.
And I think we have to assume that to do politics.
Yeah.
Otherwise, like, why would we give anyone medical care if it's their fault that they got sick?
Yeah.
Which to some degree, like, your diet and whether you exercise.
I just was thinking ultimately, not in that very...
Well, we're doing metaphysics and ontological politics here, so we have to make these distinctions, but...
Yeah.
It's, saying that everything's a social construct, I feel like, overplays the freedom that humans have to just make the world the way they want it to be.
Yeah, and I also think it's kind of like... Nobody believes that, really.
Right.
Nobody acts that way. If they do, they're, typically, not favored by most people because it's kind of antisocial.
But then on the other hand, like, I don't want to be asserting essences like about sex or gender, for example. You know, I get that there's fluidity.
Essentialisms.
There are norms, and normally
I think it's better to describe, well, I guess there's norms, but there's also there's truly a polarity in all things.
Yeah, but a biological norm is not the same as a social norm, where a social norm, it's like, it should be that way.
Yeah.
Biological norms, no, it's just usually that there's not good or bad or should or shouldn't. It's just usually the tendency is.
Yeah.
But that leaves plenty of room for divergence, and divergent gender expressions.
Or we could say difference, or
different gender expressions, or sex expressions. I mean, when you open the door to technological and medical augmentation of the body, then the boundary between biological man and woman really does get blown open.
That's what's interesting to think about, as we were discussing in that video about the virus.
Right.
Just the introduction of these technologies that, you know, well, just the future of gene therapy and the manipulation of the human organism. It could go to you know, who knows? Maybe it could be push to like some kind of transformation of physical sex.
Right. And so I think we would both agree that we're not essentialists in the sense that we think that there is some patriarchal family structure and gender roles for biologically differentiated members of our species, that you have to play that because that's natural. That's not what we're saying.
Not at all.
But that doesn't mean that there aren't other structures and the influence of other agencies, natural and divine, that shape who and what we are. Right? And that we have to be in relationship to that. Again, I'm just repeating myself. And so it's like, I feel like this sort of metaphysics is essential to having a better kind of political discourse where we do respect everyone's expression of who they are, to the extent that it doesn't trample on other people's expression. But we're always going to be negotiating that in the agora and making our categories together.
Well, you know, it's interesting, just thinking about how Abigail was, the initial, I guess, question she opened with was, what is a mother, basically?
Yeah.
And I've thought about this, actually, because I was in this little show that was called, what is it called? Something about mothers. And so, like, the people in the show had to write something about their mother or being a mother or something like that, and then present it on stage for Mother's Day. And I did that, and I wrote about my mother, and then also just my experience of kind of carrying on this similar archetype of the nurturer, but kind of fused with, you know, some personality that we share that's more artistic. But anyway, the question of what is mother, you know, and I think it's very helpful to bring in the transpersonal and the archetypal, because then we can say that anyone who's really like living into that role is participating in the mother archetype. But then there's also the difference between there is the reality of the experience of giving birth that only certain bodies experience, whether it's, you know, someone who identifies as a trans man, that's possible, or a woman, I guess cisgender female, or even someone who identifies differently. But that is definitely part of, I would, I guess, include that within this archetype of motherhood, giving birth. But also some mothers, or some, you know, women who give birth, or individuals who give birth, don't want to be mothers. Or they decide not to be mothers, you know? So that's interesting, you know, because would you still call her the mother? But then, you know, we see in culture there's this depiction of people who, you know, whose mothers or parents gave them up for adoption, biological mothers, and they want to know who that one is. So I feel like that's a very human desire. Or maybe, who knows, maybe it's just in our culture, because our culture's so, the nuclear family divisions. Maybe people wouldn't feel that in certain, more traditional tribal contexts.
Lineage is an interesting form of kinship that is more differentiated. I mean, there's a sense that those are my kids. This is my offspring, not yours, and that's how the divine right of kings was passed down, and that's how property is passed down.
Related to blood. Remember, blood was something so different for people,
but
in the past,
there is an agency at the level of blood.
Yeah,
and I think one way of looking at the evolution of consciousness is the shift in what the human will through love can do to overcome the agency of blood when it's trying to act to separate us into lineages that deny their kinship with each other.
This is very interesting. This is actually Rudolf Steiner talks about this in relation to the evolution of consciousness, and there was some kind of relationship between when human beings started reproducing outside of their clan or lineage, and the development of like more individuated forms of consciousness.
Definitely.
That's very interesting. And also Lisa Romero talks about, especially in our time, in her perspective, or Steiner's, that we're being called to like develop friendship, which is beyond the blood bond love.
Right.
And it has no what's the word? No requirements, I guess, of the friend, or no, you're not bound to them.
It's not a logic of exchange that determines the nature of your
dependence. It's like, there's, I would say, interdependence, but there's it's a different kind of love that is free, I guess. It's like, it can be freely given.
Right.
Whereas, you could say similar things about parents and their children, but that's not really what happens, right? The blood bond love, even if you really dislike members of your family, like a lot of times you still feel bound to them.
Yeah.
Even in love, some kind of love.
Right.
But yes, and I think that's related to what you're describing.
Well, the blood bond is perfectly real, and it's not going away.
Exactly.
But
there's this kind of necessity for a planetary.
Right. And
culture.
What's interesting is that typically in politics today, it's the Christians who are most trans-exclusionary, transphobic, asserting this essential whatever, and the family values. But if you read the New Testament, Jesus literally says, if you do not hate your mother and your father, you cannot walk with me.
Yeah. Actually, that was a quote I recently came across. I can't remember what it was in relation to, but it was actually, I think it was in relation to things like this. It's so counterintuitive, but it kind of forces the indwelling of God, potentially. I shouldn't say forces.
Well, it's about the universality of belonging, or the kinship. Yeah. So in Christ's kingdom, everyone is kin.
Yeah.
There's no more of a sense of separation into lineage. All human races are the same in God's eyes.
Yeah.
That's what Christ says. He's replacing the Mosaic law that was just for Jews. Now,
and that's an ideal, though, right?
It's an ideal, yes.
And on the way to such an ideal, if one was, aspiring for such an ideal, one would recognize that in order to get there, we can't, bypass history.
Right.
We have to, account for, the relations between the lineages. And almost, resolve things. Heal things.
We have to heal things, but that could take 1,000 years.
Yeah.
And so right now I feel like pragmatically, politically, the way that I try to orient here is that I just have compassion and understanding for trans people, definitely, but also for feminists who want to make sure that their kind of womanhood is not erased by being...
That these differences are...
there's differences, and we can all respect one another's freedom of expression, and enshrine that legally and economically to the extent that it's relevant, and make sure that nobody's rights are trampled on. But it's not necessarily that a feminist biological woman is transphobic or hates trans people just because they want to protect their own turf, as it were. You know? And so we need to, like, find ways. It's ontological politics that's pluralistic, where we, like, find ways of coexisting as kin despite our differences in kind.
Well, that's what's interesting about this kind of entering of ontological politics onto the scene, is because people are still, like, living in a world, so everybody's trying to force each other.
Yeah. Right. Like, you can't exist because the way I believe says you can't. Like, well, maybe your beliefs, like, need to be revised.
You need to feel about it the way that I do, or, you know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. Politics is a lot about feelings, huh?
Well, I guess so. It doesn't have to be, but...
No, it shouldn't be. That's why...
feelings are not just, like, extraneous things. But...
No, I don't mean to make them extraneous. They're always going to be a part of it, but bringing metaphysics... I mean, I'm a Whiteheadian, right? So feeling is a pretty important category for me, but...
Yes.
In politics, we need metaphysics precisely because we need to be reasonable.
Well, yeah, they're just...
Which is, in a Whiteheadian way, all about being relational. You know, acknowledging our kinship with each other in the way that we're literally made of one another. We're made out of each other. You know, my gender and your gender, the roles that we play, we're not separate.
Yeah.
We're co-creating that. That's what it means, that it's it's not an individual construct. It's a social construct. We're creating it together, right? So gender isn't... It's really not something as an individual you just get to decide what you are. It's because of the way that you're able to navigate society, what other people accept you as. That helps to shape even your desire to be this or that.
Well, but also...
To some extent,
you know, you could grow and feel resistance to what people... expect of you, you know, and that's like not even just it's not just for the sake of rebelling, but that you feel actually oppressed by, you know, being forced to act certain ways or expected to act certain ways. When
a negative relationship is still a relationship. It's a response to the oppression, you know, like...
Yeah, exactly. So a renegotiation that signals that there needs to be a renegotiation and an expansion of what we deem acceptable.
Right. Yeah. I mean, what should be the foundational principle, metaphysically speaking, of political organization? I mean, it's an ethical principle, right? So there's the golden rule,
It's interesting because if we were to, you know, sort of think along the three-folding lines, you know? This is a complicated issue because, you know, I think there's something about, you know, gender and sexuality and our, that being related to the cultural sphere, or how we understand that, the metaphysics and stuff, and then the rights, political, you know,
So when it's just...
They're not separate completely.
Right. But, yeah, so the rights that we have politically are not necessarily... Like, we could have a lot of kind of cultural disagreements, but we all have to respect that there are rights that individuals have.
Exactly, yeah.
And rights that certain associations have, and now usually that's corporations under capitalism, but it could be churches, schools, any form of... It's not just individuals that have rights, it's also groups of individuals who form some common cause. So we want to respect that too, with the caveat that corporate charter law sucks and is destroying everything. But the idea that corporations are persons, but associations of people are not persons. We need to define them differently, but they have rights, that's what. We can respect the rights of those entities, which requires agreement about, I guess, how much leeway individuals and their associations have to express themselves. And we can, but I guess culturally we're always going to express in a different way because we're individuals and we're free.
Yeah. It's complicated.
Sure is. But the role of the government for Steiner in his social threefolding is not to like engineer society.
Yeah, exactly.
By imposing a top-down sense of like how the family is supposed to be structured and who can have an abortion when, and I mean that's another sticky issue about rights. You know, like should the government be making that decision, or should doctors be making that decision, or should mothers be making that decision, or should it's like.
Gosh, yeah, that's very complicated.
Because the baby has rights at some point, too, that need to be protected. The mother has rights as an individual over her own body. The doctor is the trained expert who's supposed to heal. I don't think we have the time or the energy to get into abortion now, but just another one of those issues that ontological politics has to deal with.
That's sort of what I didn't read the whole essay, but I'm planning to. But Barfield has an essay on abortion, and it was sort of like bringing in the kind of ontological differences. He was sort of describing two different camps, basically, and their need to reconcile or to like listen to each other.
Yeah. We don't have many forums for that anymore.
Oh, yeah. There's just so much violence in the world.
Well, we can't end on that note.
Yeah, we can't. So...
Well, we still have YouTube.
Yeah, and it's really great. I liked what Abigail did. And
yeah, I thought it was
what people are doing.
It was a constructive
YouTube.
Contribution.
It is. YouTube does kind of provide space for that,
It does, despite all the critiques that I have and others have.
Of course, it's not perfect.
I just wanted to, make sure that we recognize how it affords this type of conversation, and it's in some ways the closest thing we have to an agora in the contemporary moment,
Yeah.
Clearly, all the protests in the world, even when they do get violent, aren't that effective. They might even be counterproductive.
I don't know. I don't feel like I know either way.
Well, protest is different than, say, like a general strike. I think organizing labor would actually be effective, but that's not what's been happening for the most part.
Yeah.
I mean, there are some instances of labor trying to organize and
we were in some pretty
having mixed results.
Like dire situations, though, right? Collectively. So it wasn't. I'm not surprised that it wasn't organized. It was more just
it was organized.
Something being organized, but you were saying
it's a protest rather than organizing labor in a way that would actually leverage power against the capitalist class.
That's really what needs to happen, because
the capitalists have insurance. They don't care if all the buildings get destroyed. I mean,
we need to overcome this divisiveness. Come together and not let ourselves be manipulated and what's the word? Entranced by the people who have a lot of money, who have a lot of money going towards media and
media hygiene is super important.
And technologies.